Thank you very much for the talk. What my impression is that at the end, I mean, the second half of your talk seems like a contrast of the first part of your talk. Yeah. But I just have a really simple question. Is like you show the work of Lev Manovich and then you compared it with Gerhard Richter. I feel really sorry for Richter that such a comparison happened. But but I'm wondering what is the therapeutic part of Lev Manovich's work, which I couldn't see anything at all. Can you explain?
I agree. I agree. What I found was interesting is that at least he's talking now about painting with data, which is at least, interesting. Like it's kind of like getting away from, and I don't want to be a meanie to him because he's done many wonderful things. But the big visualization that he's doing these days, I kind of like, well, I don't see the point of them, right? But at least he's doing that idea, like that turn that he says, I'm trying to paint with data, which is something that he would never say before. So that's what I wanted to get at, right? To do the comparison, this compared to this, there's no comparison in many ways, right? But then there is kind of like maybe a recognition there, that there needs to be another approach to data, which is much more about the care, right? The caring, the curating, right? And this idea of that you need to care about data. You cannot just put it all together and hoping that some kind of, trans-individuation is going to happen. It's an enormous mistake to do so. Yeah, so that's the comparison. I think this
Thanks. I have two questions. One actually follows exactly from Yuki's point, but was caused by an accident in listening, but also to Lev Manovich's Kiev images, because I understood you reading, I think of myself as an artist who is painting with data, not with data.
Data, yeah.
So I was wondering whether that mishearing, that failure of hearing actually has something, it does entail something, because certainly Dada had a very therapeutic idea of their own traumatic, shocking artistic intervention. So I was wondering whether there is something therapeutic, or could be, in collaging, montaging bits and pieces from everyday life. So that was the first question. The second is just I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this NUI project, because if I understood you right, among the people doing this are artists, which are at the same time probably the most celebrated misfits of our culture, because they do exactly what is in the title of your talk. They have a therapeutic relationship with software. They are diligent enough to repair our software to make it even run smoother in neoliberal capitalist society.
All right. So the first one about data, I think that's a good point. I didn't talk too much about trauma, but that's also another approach you can have, because that kind of gets also at the breakdowns and failures and radical failures. I didn't talk too much about it because that would take us in other ways, but let's just say that it's interesting to look at the dark side of social media. If you want, there's a Wired article that came out recently about the dark side of immaterial labor, which was talking about people who do all the, oh my God, my words, who look at content, who they authorize content or remove content or fancy content and so on and so forth. And it's a big labor, and it's been sent to the Philippines now and so on and so forth. And if you look at the article, it's kind of like really looking at trauma because it's the worst of the worst that they have to deal with. It's the death of kittens and sexual violence and so on and so forth that they remove from the YouTube, from the Facebook and all that, to give this impression of a very smooth, fictional kind of everybody's happy and socially connected world. And so that would be a way to look about it, because that's the dark side of social media. It's, if you want, that's the underbelly of social media, and that would be one way to approach it. What are all those, content that doesn't make it because it's so traumatizing? And those people who are working in those areas, at a very low salary in the Philippines, are completely traumatized and suffering from PTSD and all that sort of thing. So that would be one way to think about it and an approach. Definitely. Nuit. Nuit. Nuit is interesting because, and I don't know too much about how it functions because all the documentation is in Japanese, sorry, and so you have to pretty much go there to figure out what's going on. And I'm hoping to go there to figure out what's going on. It's an art therapy project. What was interesting and is that those kind of representation, and you see a lot of the embroidery, the stitching done on shirts and all that, and it used to be sold at fairly high prices, and that would serve to finance the establishment and so on and so forth. And now apparently they have completely changed their approach, and they're trying to build a collection, an archive, and they're not selling anymore. That would be that. In terms of the relationship between the people who are doing the stitching, the residents and the artists, I have no idea. I would really need to go there, and that's one of my interests, to figure out what kind of relationships they have. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. I thought that was really interesting, and it struck me listening to you that there'd be a really interesting way too for you to perhaps become involved with the project in Ecuador that is being undertaken by the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation. The reason I say that, I'll build up to it. So you mentioned the debate over what would constitute the first techniques, fire on one hand and thread on the other. And now you may know this already, but permit you me to put forward a couple of references here. The debate as it currently stands in evolutionary sciences between Richard Wrangham in a book called Cooking with Fire, where he talks about the evolution of Homo erectus being a product of fire because it's fire that allowed the caloric intake to allow the expansion of the brain capacity. And so that was 3 million years ago, 1.2 million years ago, I think so. The other argument comes, less interesting, but nonetheless very interesting, comes from a guy based in the UK called Timothy Taylor in a book called The Artificial Ape, where he argues that the first techniques wasn't fire, it was the sling, which enabled mothers to carry babies, and that was the origin of the division of labour. It was the fact that you could, no longer taking care of children the whole time, you could undertake some form of exploratory hunting. But taking that a bit further and looking at the techniques of thread, and the reason I think this could be so interesting in relation to the Ecuador project is because you probably know the Incan Aztec form of writing was through quipus, the threading, an entire writing system based on the threading and knotting, which strikes me as a major area of general organology and technical inquiry that we will have to engage with on some level. And the kind of things that you're looking at in relation to material seems to be the closest that anyone's doing from within this sphere for the time being.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I got to say that the textile project, a lot of it is like becoming its own little beast at this point in my mind, and I'm working with textile artists at this point to kind of think about this idea of transindividuation, looking back at ancient techniques, really. And so that's really interesting to hear that. I also want to add that, textile, in some ways, what interests me in that is that it's kind of not an art form yet, or it's like there is such a thing as textile arts, but it's kind of like not very well respected, because textile is also something that decomposes really fast. It's really hard to keep textiles. So, and that's what I found was interesting to think about it as social media, because it has such a notion of transmission too, that you need to keep people to learn how to stitch, how to embroider, and so on and so forth, because it's gonna decompose after a few generations, right? And so there's that idea of like that kind of memory that is being passed along, in some ways this inscription of memory that is being passed along and codified through different forms of textile, different ways of doing things, cutting cloth and so on and so forth. So definitely, thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking during your talk about Christopher Kelty and his work on his concept of the recursive public. So a public that's produced not just through discourse but through material objects and so on, which somewhat applies to what you were talking about later on about textiles. But what I was wondering is, going back to the first part of your talk, what is the advantage of concepts like trans-individuation and ethics to a discussion of software over, or software production, over something like a normative concept like the public?
Yeah. I was going to say, because I'm not a hacker, and Kelty talks about hackers a lot. What I want to say is, like, I want to foster a much more, I'm going to say, intimate engagement, to use the word, which even though it's kind of like always a bit weird to say that. But we need to have, and what trans-individuation, what is interesting about that is that if you think about public, because publics and all that, you enter into the realm of code, law, and so on and so forth, which I'm not denying, there's tremendous need for new legislation, regulations, and so on and so forth, as Antoinette was saying yesterday. But we need also an ethics of care, right? And in a sense, and I was really inspired by reading Yuke's chapter on the personal archive, right? And what does it mean to be personally involved in archiving, in being, in doing our own social media archiving, in trying to find ways to really becoming our own archivist and not let that process be taken over by a black box software, somewhere else. And so that's what I want to push forward, and that's what I think is kind of missing in a lot of discussions sometimes about how we get together and think about software, is that ethics of care, and that has to get to the trans individual, and that gets to ethics, and that gets to therapeutics. So it's really complementary in that sense, but just another approach. Yeah.
I would like to point out a question of methodology concerning software studies. I believe that today we should open a kind of discussion of a kind of epistemology of software studies, because yesterday morning we discussed of digital milieu, and a software is a kind of object into a digital milieu with other softwares, etc. And we need today to work on also on architecture studies, network studies, and we need a general organology of the digital itself, of the specificity of this new technical milieu, because focusing on software only is methodologically problematic, and this is also a question of the goals and the methods of therapeutic and critical pharmacology, etc., etc. Yesterday I said I think we need today to develop a practical organology that is also a development of platforms, for example, etc. I know that this question was addressed, for example, by our common friend Gert Leving, and in a book you participated in. But I think we must not stay in an empirical question here. We must work with concept by Yuke, for example, on digital objects, but we must create a general approach of the layers of this world, that is a digital world. Because if we address only software, for example, we are completely, there is a blind face, that is the main question. And the political, for example, the vectorialist in the sense of Ken McKenzie work, addresses this question of this blind side. It is also the question of algorithmic governmentality. And we must now develop a toolbox, if it's possible to say that, for answering these discourses and for deconstructing these digital ideologies, etc.
Do you want me to say something? Okay. No, I agree. I agree for the deconstruction of digital ideologies, and that's the kind of like a really hard part to do, actually, because they're so ingrained now. because they already appeared as ideology, and we didn't really have alternatives until after the fact, or like now we're struggling to keep up with alternatives in many ways. So, and for sure, the work of Gert Loving and the Unlikers project is pretty phenomenal in that sense. What I want to say too is that in terms of toolbox, what's becoming more and more important is to do media archaeology. And to really think about, media archaeology is like this idea of looking at obsolete, old, disappeared media, because it gives points of comparison, right? And so at this point, that's kind of like the method, that I'm kind of trying to really focus on, in this kind of particular project. But then it can open up, because we need to redefine the notion of the digital, and especially that notion that there's the analog and the digital, and then they're separated, because they're not anymore. It's just so it doesn't hold anymore. It cannot work like that anymore. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I haven't a question, but an observation. It's about the ability of software to visualize quantification, and I'm referring to your two first examples. They use quantification in a contrasting way, even opposite way. And the first one was absolutely fascinating from a visual point of view. But it seemed to me very disturbing. The idea of reducing, say, social struggle to quantifiable entities. In Deleuzian terms, it's a reduction of a qualitative multiplicity to a quantitative multiplicity.
Yeah.
And it's very close to a certain Italian ideology that turns social struggle, or tries to understand social struggle in terms of the amount of clashes with police. While the second example is exactly doing the contrary. I mean, it's using quantification to open instead of closing it, to open the notion, the closure, the conceptual closure of homosexuality in this case. So I was struck by this contrast.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I would agree with what you say pretty much. Yeah.
We will end here because it's time.
It's time.